Hello, everybody. Wanted to call your attention to a couple items. Items in the sense of articles that were published, and also in the more abstract sense. In terms of the articles, I had two published today, one in the New York Daily News and one in the Spectator. And of course, I will link to both of them in the description box. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of an elaboration on both. Start with the Spectator piece. As some of you may know, if you've been following my tweets or if you watched the previous video, I was in South Carolina this past weekend and I spoke to 16 presidential candidates. 16, count them. Now, some of them are more newsworthy than others, so I didn't incorporate all the comments that they gave me into articles, but I structured the bits that struck me as particularly notable into two articles. The first one in the Spectator dealt largely with Bernie because I was able to have a quick chat with him, which is a little unusual because he doesn't tend to do spontaneous news gaggle type interactions, largely because he rightly has disdain for most journalists whose main motivation when they're dealing with presidential candidates is to just get a soundbite quote out of them that will perpetuate whatever the news cycle happens to be at the time. And the news cycle that was raging at the time was the Joe Biden segregationist stuff, which, as I could have predicted, did not register all that much with voters. The fact that that was the controversy that raged for about a week straight really says more about the media, which chose to generate the controversy, than it does about the electorate or even Biden himself. It was a media creation. But because journalists are so kind of tethered to the news cycle, they basically directed all their questions to that issue when they were engaging with presidential candidates. At least that was my observation. But I asked Bernie about something else. I actually asked him a historical question because there's an incident that some of you might be aware of that's gotten a little bit of press since Bernie actually since he started running last cycle, about an incident that occurred at the Vermont Democratic Caucus in 1988. Bernie was one of the very few white politicians of any prominence who endorsed Jesse Jackson that year. Jesse Jackson was largely viewed as a factional black candidate. So, if you recall when Obama ran in 2007, 2008, one of the big questions was, could he transcend being a factional black candidate? Could he create an appeal that actually was cross-racial, that spanned educational backgrounds and other demographics, and Obama did that. And that was evidenced by Obama winning the Iowa caucus in 2008. And Iowa is an overwhelmingly white state. Jesse Jackson seldom did well in white states. He mostly racked up wins in the Deep South. But the one exception actually was Vermont. Jackson won the Vermont caucus largely because activists and organizers sort of commandeered the process in 1988 and handed him a victory. And Bernie was one of those. Even though he was mayor of Burlington at the time, he campaigned for Jesse Jackson. And one of his constituents in Vermont was so incensed by Bernie doing this that she actually approached him and slapped him across the face. You can go read about this in contemporaneous reports in the New York Times and other newspapers. So I actually thought it was relevant to bring that up to Bernie because we were in South Carolina. South Carolina's Democratic electorate is majority black. So in order for Bernie or anybody else to stand a chance of winning in South Carolina, you have to appeal to black voters. Again, obviously, they're not a monolith. There are divides generationally and in other respects among black voters, so it shouldn't oversimplify things. But nonetheless, the most reliable segment of voters in that primary tend to be older black voters who are more religious than the average Democrat and more kind of connected to the black political system in the South, which is and if you're a Democrat in the South, you're going to be part of a political constituency that is largely black. So I wanted to get Bernie to reminisce a little bit about what actually happened there, because I hadn't heard him comment much at all. If he has at all, I haven't seen it, on that incident in 1988 when he was physically attacked by a constituent, simply because they didn't like the fact that he endorsed Jesse Jackson. And so Bernie did comment on it for me, and he said that there was somebody that was upset that they were challenging the Democratic establishment in Vermont at the time, and many of the people in the state associated with the establishment of the party didn't like the fact that there were these, quote, outsiders swooping into the caucus process and, tilting it in a certain direction that was not viewed as favorable by the, power elite, to the extent that such a thing exists in Vermont. And Bernie gave a quote on that, and I believe, I could be wrong, but I think it's the only time that I'm aware of that he's actually commented on that incident. But it does show that he has, something of a connection, at least to black activist movements dating back decades, which theoretically could be an asset for him as he tries to build up a stature in the South. And I also happened to talk to Jesse Jackson himself, who was at the Democratic Convention in South Carolina in Columbia on Saturday. And Jackson was aware of Bernie doing this in 1988. And Jackson said that he supports Bernie for doing so. Now, Jackson didn't endorse Bernie. Frankly, Jackson's Parkinson's is getting pretty severe at this point. So he mumbles a lot, and you have to kind of listen carefully in order to understand what he's saying. But he did say, that he supports Bernie, even though he's not outright endorsing him. So I thought it was interesting to get that on the record, especially given the attention being focused on the sentiments of especially black voters in the South and namely in South Carolina. So I'd recommend reading that piece. I was actually surprised by the overt antipathy that was expressed toward Bernie among some of the Democratic officials that I spoke to. One really prominent example of that is this gentleman named Anton Gunn, who was the first person that Barack Obama hired for his primary campaign in South Carolina in 2007, who later went on to serve in the Obama administration in the Health and Human Services Department. And, this Gunn is not endorsing any candidate right now. He has positive things to say about a variety of the candidates, but not Bernie. He actually told me that he doesn't think Bernie should have been allowed to run in the primaries, whether in 2016 or this time, because he's not technically a Democrat. Now, that distinction is so silly and arbitrary because even though Bernie technically still does have an I next to his name, in that in the voter rolls in Vermont, he's registered as an independent, for all intents and purposes, functionally Bernie is a Democrat. He serves in the Democratic leadership in the Senate. He received millions of votes in the Democratic primaries and caucuses in 2016. He's gone around the country electing Democrats. So the people who hate him, who latch on to this notion that he's not a Democrat, they're being frivolous and they're using a petty grudge to try to justify their animus toward Bernie. Now, you might have an argument that Bernie ought to be more distant from the Democratic establishment, that he shouldn't do things like co-writing op-eds in the New York Times with Chuck Schumer or appearing at friendly events with Andrew Cuomo. But Bernie has done those sorts of things because he, I think, at least somewhat accurately inferred that in order to win the nomination of the party, you got to be at least on good, cordial terms with segments of the party's establishment core. Now, you could call that a capitulation on Bernie's part, or that he's selling out. Okay, fine. But to use it as a basis to kind of continue this crude disdain toward him, if you're a Democratic official, is just so arbitrary and silly. Bernie actually could be a serious asset to the Democratic Party, and they've basically adopted a huge portion of his agenda. So if he's that much of an interloper, which is what Gunn called him, why is it that so many candidates have decided that Bernie's platform is actually politically advantageous for them to espouse? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think the fact that Gunn would go so far as to say Bernie should be prevented from running in the primaries is itself very telling, given Gunn's stature. But, the negative feeling toward Bernie, just in my discussions with ordinary voters, was pretty evident. I mean, there was one woman who I spoke to at the Jim Clyburn Fish Fry who basically blamed Bernie for costing Hillary the election. This was a middle-aged black woman who told me that she's leaning toward Warren or Harris. So not even a Biden person, although there are plenty of those as well. But this woman was telling me how, Bernie had sour grapes and he had a huge ego and he didn't do enough to help Hillary. Bernie, again, went all over the country campaigning for Hillary, even though they were adversaries. I mean, and Hillary is not somebody who Bernie would be naturally inclined to support in that sense. And yet, what did he get for his efforts? Not much, as far as I can gather. His poll numbers have gone down, both in the early states and nationally. At least at this juncture, he's not making inroads that he ought to be making. And it's ominous for him because his name recognition is already sky high. It's not like last time where he had to build up an identity politically, and therefore at an early stage in the process, it would have been expected for him to be lagging behind. That's just not the case this time. He's one of the best known political figures in the country. So for him to be going down the polls should be worrisome if you're a Bernie supporter. And I don't think you can write it off as that people aren't paying attention. I think actually an unusual number of people are paying very close attention, even at this relatively early stage. People are hyper-politicized right now. They're hyper-engaged. The specter of Trump looming over everything makes people much more inclined to make politics of part of their daily lives than they have been in the past. I don't think you can dismiss it as purely a function of the early stage of the primary. Yeah, that's probably a component, but in Bernie's case, I don't know. I don't think it bodes particularly well for him. I still think he has a good chance to win the nomination outright. Frankly, I think they have to really focus on Iowa, where he has an organizational base that he can build upon, and he almost won Iowa last time. And this time he only has to maintain a plurality rather than get a majority. So Iowa actually is, if I were advising the campaign, which I'm not, I would tell them, if you had to put all your eggs in one basket, make it Iowa, especially because it's a caucus, which privileges organizational prowess and activism. Sort of like when Bernie endorsed Jesse Jackson in the in the Vermont caucus in 1988. Jackson ended up winning that caucus not because he had necessarily had broad base support in Vermont, but because he had the most adept organizational support base, and that's. But the other thing that sort of disadvantages Bernie is fewer and fewer states now have caucuses. A couple of them have gotten rid of caucuses entirely, like Washington State, Maine, and Bernie did disproportionately well in caucus states in 2016. So if there are fewer of them this time, that's not necessarily great for Bernie. Anyway, I encourage you to read that piece. And I have another one in the New York Daily News. Basically, I just kind of synthesized a bunch of the interactions I had with candidates. Bill de Blasio, for example, who I spoke to on multiple occasions, reiterated his belief to me that Trump had committed treason. De Blasio said that Trump had 100% committed treason. That was his phrasing. And de Blasio drew that conclusion because of Trump's interview with George Stephanopoulos from a week or so ago, 10 days ago, whenever that was, where Trump indicated that he would be open to taking information from foreigners. Apparently, according to de Blasio, that's treason. And one thing I speculate is that de Blasio and a couple others like Gillibrand have to kind of amp up their rhetorical intensity, especially with respect to Trump, because they don't have a lot of grassroots energy or support. So in order to compensate for that, they're just kind of throwing everything at the wall rhetorically and hoping that kind of gains them some kind of traction. But it's no substitute for actually having an energized support base. One funny irony is that there are actually 3 candidates from New York running. The mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, the junior senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Andrew Yang. And who had the most boisterous and aggressive supporters in South Carolina, at least per my observations? Yang. Not the mayor, not the senator, Andrew Yang. So what does that tell you? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that Andrew Yang is going to win any primaries or caucuses, but having an enthusiastic core like that actually is a basis to build upon. And it doesn't look like de Blasio and Gillibrand, for example, have that. And, Gillibrand told me that collusion's not a settled issue. The impeachment inquiry that she's calling for should incorporate collusion as something that needs to be further investigated. Beto told me that he also doesn't believe collusion is a settled issue, even though, I don't know how you read Volume 1 of the Mueller report and not conclude that collusion/conspiracy was authoritatively debunked, beyond a reasonable doubt. But, not according to them. I got another candidate on the record for actually calling for impeachment proceedings to begin. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, who is going to be in the debates. He's got at least some stature. He had been sort of non-committal in terms of whether he was calling for impeachment proceedings to be initiated. And in my interview with him, I think he actually did articulate that for the first time. That's also in the Daily News piece. There's a... Just read the piece. I think you kind of will get the gist of it. I'm going to Miami tomorrow for the debates. At minimum, I'm going to be at the first night. I'm going to try to get into the second night as well. We'll see what happens. So if you're in the area and have any recommendations or you want to have any podcast suggestions, let me know. I'm going to bring my gear with me. But for tomorrow, I'm going to put together a podcast actually with a bunch of the clips that I got that didn't necessarily make it into the articles, just so you can hear my interactions with the candidates. I actually spoke to Biden as well. And the only way you could really talk to Biden, because he doesn't do much press availability at all, he's kind of hiding, is you have to just kind of go up to him as he's interacting with voters on the, quote, rope line. And I asked him about his position on impeachment. He accused me of misrepresenting him, which is totally untrue. It's absolutely true that he has been ambiguous about his position on impeachment, or at the very least, he has not called for the initiation of impeachment proceedings, unlike several others in the race. I think we're now at a majority, or even like a supermajority of Democratic candidates having indeed called for impeachment proceedings to begin, but Biden has not. And he's not doing it really out of principle, I don't think. It's just an equivocation. It's because he's like taking the Pelosi position, essentially. But I'll put that clip in the podcast tomorrow. And I'll also, when I'm in Miami, I'll do some updates and I'll, keep you guys abreast. Was at the Red Scare podcast taping tonight. That was great. And what else? That's it. Please consider contributions on Patreon, PayPal, Bitcoin, etc. If you're interested, subscribe here on YouTube. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. And all that information is, of course, in the description box, in addition to the articles mentioned. And I will talk to you later.